Middle East. Thank you very much. Larry Wilson live here with Jim Spigener. He's the Chief Client Officer for DEKRA, and they acquired BST. If some of you are familiar with Jim and his tenure with BST, that happened a few years ago. So, Jim, welcome, and thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Larry. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to our session today.
Well, me too, Jim. I mean, even just yesterday, like talking with you on the phone, and you only had a couple minutes before your dinner arrived, and you were saying, that we're really only going to get a chance to scratch the surface here, but we've got 45 minutes where Jim and I are going to talk about how behavior-based safety really began. We were both there at the beginning, and then a bit in terms of where it's going or future directions, because we both kind of went in different directions. It was kind of interesting. It was at the just outside of the Gaylord Opry, the hotel, and he was going one way and I was going the other, and so are our directions. So we get a bit of time for that, and then questions and answers from the audience. Now our producer Mike's going to be taking the questions as they come in and the comments, sort of putting them all together for Jim and I at the end. So just before I get going with this, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, there will be, a chance for your questions at the end. We started doing Larry Wilson Live back in December with David Bianco from Epiroc, and we were talking about the challenges of global rollouts. Would have been great to have you talk and chime in on that one, Jim. And then we had Anthony Panapinto from Procter & Gamble. Now, Jim and I were on an expert panel with Anthony in North America, and we were talking about reliable leading indicators. But this one with Anthony, was just about pandemic management and mismanagement. Then we had Dr. Wadaganam from Emirates National Oil Company, talking about integrating human factors into personal safety. Then Alex Carnival, who is the CEO and president of Dynacast, talking about integrating human factors into quality, production efficiency, reliability, and customer relations. And the last show 2 weeks ago was with Keith Hole. Thousands of people have watched it. And we were talking about all of the new stuff, Safety Differently 2.0, Industry 4.0. Keith knows all of these people because he's the MC for conferences. Again, he was the MC for an expert panel that Jim and I were on reliable leading indicators for Europe. And he was just sort of helping us, sort of cut through the wheat and the chaff to sort of get to, what's the real important thing. And I think, Jim, I don't know if you saw that show, but it echoed what you said on one of the expert panels, that when you boil it down, it's about being able to make that connection with the person, right? And it really doesn't matter if you don't get that, what else you're doing, because it really doesn't work. So and I thought that was really interesting. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you may be aware of who invented behavior-based safety. Some folks think it's Dr. Thomas Krause. Some folks think it's Dr. Scott Geller. I'd already been doing behavior-based safety before those guys sort of hit the scene, if you will, with the DuPont stop program up in Canada. And the DuPont company been doing their form of behavior-based safety for years before that. So the point is, it wasn't actually new. But in the 1990s to 2000, behavior-based safety grew huge. It grew global. Jim and I were talking about this last night. Potential 35 to 45% of the companies out there that employ more than 100 people are familiar with behavior-based safety from relative obscurity. And if you're at all familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. He said you need a connector, you need a maven or an expert, but you also need a salesman. And certainly, from what I saw, Jim was the person who was that salesman. But if you read the marketing description, there's a twist as well, everybody, because this happened to me. You're the salesman, but you get to go in and do the implementations. Now you're at ground level, you're at the front lines, and it doesn't take very long before the salesman actually becomes the real expert. And that's what I started to hear when I was listening to Jim speak. I mean, I remember the first time I went there, and it was like Thomas Krause and this Jim Spigener guy. And I thought, well, you know, this Jim guy's probably a client. He's going to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes at the end and say that things work really well at their place, and that'll be it. And after about 10 minutes, Dr. Krause handed the microphone over to Jim, and I was sitting there in the audience going, well, what in the world's he doing that for? And 45 minutes later, I never asked that question again, but the only thing I thought was, why did it take you 10 minutes to hand the microphone over? So, Jim, again, thank you very much for joining the show. It's always been a pleasure talking with you. We've seen each other, ladies and gentlemen, over the years for almost 30 years. But Jim, tell us, when did you actually start with behavior-based safety? It was a bit before you joined BST. So just take us from the beginning, and I'm going to just try to be like the color commentator and kind of ask you about some of the highlights along the way, man. But
well, it was so thank you, Larry, for all that background. And I want to add, before I get into how I got there and where this went, you know, Dr. Tom Krause and Aubrey Daniel and Scott Geller, those guys were, you know, they were the academic people who took behavior-based safety out of something that was probably included in everything we did in safety a little bit, and made it with Deming and turned it into a real systematic way to approach not just behavior, but the system. So my hat's off to those guys. Without them, it just wouldn't have gone where it went. But that said, I was working in the chemical business, Larry. I had run chemical plants for 20 years, and we were struggling with safety at the company I was at. And we actually had Tom Krause and Dr. Hidley come in and do a presentation. And I was completely blown away with the way they had connected doing safety with Deming, with engagement, and without blame. And to me, I was like, where have these guys been? So consequently, we set about implementing that process in the very largest chemical plant we had in our company. And I sort of led that effort. And at
that was a cyanide plant?
Yeah, we made all kinds of stuff, but yes, I was.
It's like, see, I remember you saying, you know, like, and they're talking about these interventions. Well, we had one. We weren't allowed to fall asleep. We could make cyanide in our sleep, so we invented this thing called the snipe, and you showed everybody how you made this snipe, and you wrote up the person's. We had more people more afraid of that snipe going up their nostril than we had of getting fired. And he said, now, we didn't know that was an intervention. We didn't know what it was called in scientific terms. But, I mean, I still remember that story, and that must be 91, 92 or something like that. When you were rolling up the snipe for everybody there.
One of the things that, you know, not to get too far off the track, but the concept that we were trying to get across, that I was connecting there, was you're not going to scare people with risk. You're going to have to find a way to get people to identify the right things to do and want to do them. Nobody thinks they're going to get hurt. So we made 100% pure hydrogen cyanide, and you could take a coffee cup full of that, put everybody in a enclosed arena, biggest arena you can think of, and throw that cyanide into the air, and you could literally kill 1 million people with that 1/2 cup of cyanide. We made 2 million pounds of it every day, and yet we were not afraid of it. And so it's easy to take shortcuts and that kind of stuff if you're just operating on your experience versus what's the right thing to do and taking the time to get the right thing integrated into people. So that was the point of that. But long story short, I hired Dr. Krause to come in and help us figure out how to do that in our industry. Now, Dr. Krause is a really smart guy, but he was an academic. So he was a PhD psychologist, and Dr. Hidley, his partner, was a psychiatrist. And when they showed up and started talking in the terms they talked about, most of our people in our plant looked at them like a goat looking through a fence. It was hard to identify with them. So what I realized really quickly was we need to take this technology, which was really elegant, and figure out how do you make it fit in an industry like the chemical industry or the oil industry or metals or whatever. That we have to do that. Otherwise, our guys are we're going to have a hard time making this really work the way we want it to. I also saw it as a huge culture change. It was a way for us to get the management and the union to come together on something that was important to both of them. So we set about implementing that. And as we implemented it, we broke a lot of ground. We came up with a lot of new ways of doing things, ways to create steering committees and engagement. And Dr. Krause, to his credit, recognized that. And he began to ask me to come speak at a lot of these things. And that's where you saw me, Larry. That was a result of some of that. But in addition to that, we actually, and I was, like I said, I was still working for the chemical company. We began to have people call us who were trying to do this stuff that they had heard Dr. Krause talk about. And they were coming to our plant, and we were essentially taking the standard training from Dr. Krause and then coming to us and saying, now, how does this really work? And we were spending a significant amount of time doing that. And we implemented behavior-based safety for about 2.5 years, and we had a dramatic improvement in our safety results. We were great at engineering. We were great at having procedures. We were not so great at execution, and we were not so great at relationships between the company and the union. And those were the two things that we bridged with behavior-based safety. So in 1990, May, I guess, I left the chemical business and joined Dr. Krause. And I joined as
31 years ago officially then.
Yeah, 31 years ago, I joined Dr. Krause. I had worked with him doing this for the previous 2.5 years. And just as another aside, one of the things I recognized was there's no way that the amount of networking that needs to happen and the amount of learning that needs to occur is going to occur one-to-one. So that's how we created our SIA, Safety in Action, or what used to be termed as a users conference. And we grew that. We grew that from 12 people at the first one, 12 companies, to at the height 3,500 people coming to the conference.
This was pure coincidence that I was at the Anatola, whatever hotel in Dallas there. I was there for a completely different thing, and you guys were having your whole thing there.
Yep.
As well, right?
Yep.
And I think there was at least 2,200 people there.
That was a bunch. Yeah, bunch.
But I mean, the thing is, as it started to grow, Jim, give us maybe just a sense of like at the beginning, how many implementations, year 1, year 2, like the maybe a bit of the snowball, how it went, because I think a lot, let's face it, Jim, there's a lot of people listening who weren't in safety 31 years ago.
Yep.
I think our producer said, I think you guys started in behavior-based safety when I was born. So give us a bit of a feel for the, like it had been fairly, I would say, fairly flat, DuPont stop sales, things like that. Not necessarily a lot of growth. And then in 1990, it like to go from, I don't want to say zero because it wasn't zero, but
Right.
To that level. I mean, you can go anywhere in the world, and the sophisticated companies, especially in oil and gas, will have a behavior-based observation process, and there'll be a fairly good chance that you or DEKRA was involved in it, or us, or somebody else. But I mean, you know, it's all over, Jim. It's not like you can go to Brazil, you can go to Chile, you can go to India. I mean,
so Larry, let me take just a little bit of a step back and give you that when my perspective, what that evolution was, because I think it's important to going forward also. So at the time behavior-based safety got introduced as a formal process, and we began to build a little bit of momentum to it and really kind of shape it. So it was totally different shaped in 1985 when Dr. Krause implemented at a refinery in Geismar than it was when I actually implemented in 1990. And let me tell you what that was and then how that really spurred the growth. It was mostly done by supervisors originally. So it was supervisors out observing. Well, and even stop was pretty much that way, right? So, So as I got involved in it, I realized this was a great engagement mechanism. So about mid-'80s, Dr. Deming came into vogue, early '80s, and people began to recognize the socio-tech theory of getting the worker engaged was a really smart thing to do, not just because you got more ownership from them, but you got ideas and you captured their creativity. So we had two things happening at that time, perfect storm. Dr. Deming talking about quality, not blaming people, trying to figure out where the variation is and remove it. And at the same time, we had a huge tidal wave starting of engagement. So we bundle those two things together. And that attraction, we far underestimated that attraction. And the reason I say this is so important is this pandemic has taken us from engagement backwards in a lot of ways. And so engagement was what made behavior-based safety really work. I mean, if you would have had supervisors doing this all along and that's all you had, you would have never seen what we saw as far as results and improvement. I can point to in my career 30 years.
Let me just, for some of the people listening, let me just, if I can, punctuate what you just said there. The engagement was what really made it work. And if you were back then, if you, for instance, heard Dr. Aubrey Daniels speaking about behavior-based safety, he was talking about the ABC theory, PICS and NICS, positive, immediate, certain, negative, immediate, certain, and changing the consequence structure for safety, which was normally late, uncertain, negative, not a very motivating consequence. That was the behavioral science. I just wanted everybody to hear what you said, Jim, which is what really made it work was the engagement.
Yeah. So
the PICS and the NICS, you know, like really, I don't think that was it. I think it was that you got people engaged, you got them thinking, you got them talking, and every now and again, on a really golden observation, you'd kind of find something that would improve the job one way or another, right? You know, eliminating the risk, or negating the risk if there was an error or a mistake or something, you know, like, but it was much more about the engagement than it was about changing the consequence. So anyway, just carry on.
Let me take that a little further. So engagement was sort of the gas in the engine, right? But the engine design was important also. In other words, what do you engage people in? It matters. So just including people in something that they can't really see a way to add value in is a waste of time, and it frustrates them. So what we did with behavior-based safety was we took some science. We took applied behavior analysis, of course, which you just sort of explained briefly, but we also took the quality science. So our method of doing this was to sort back through the incident reports and come up with the behaviors that over and over again over the past 5 or 6 years had been involved in most of your critical accidents, and focus on them. So we got the hourly employees to actually do that research. We formed a steering committee. They actually did that research. And then to make observation more accurate, we had them define what does that behavior look like when it's being done correctly, so that when somebody's out observing, they can, without error or a lot of variation, they can make some decisions about whether that's the right way or not. And then we had those groups go out and vet that with all of the hourly employees, so that now we had everyone understanding what we were really trying to do was measure where the behaviors were occurring in a way that could get people hurt. Now,
it's interesting you said that too, Jim.
Hold on, I want to finish this thought. Now, that was half of behavior-based safety. That was the part about going out, observing, giving people feedback, getting them to recognize these behaviors. The second part was collecting that data and having those same hourly employees look at that data and understand why is it. Now we're back to Aubrey Daniels's picks and nicks and all that. Why is it that people are more likely to do that behavior the wrong way than the right way? And we looked at the system and we began to change the system. Now, that was perfection. That's the world we wanted. The reality is most people did the front half of behavior-based safety and didn't do such a good half of the second half. And that is part of the reason that behavior-based safety, although it has achieved so much, I mean, the research is in. We just did a study at Cambridge University, do a study for us. That without a doubt, it is a powerful injury reduction mechanism. And they said it is also the most powerful culture change mechanism that they have ever seen.
They also said the best engagement one as well, too.
It is, exactly. But my point is, it could come back. I believe behavior-based safety has a second life. And the second life is doing the second half of it better. I really do. I believe that a lot of companies could see, all these companies are talking about human performance improvement. That's a big buzzword out there now. Human performance improvement really means making the system easier to do the right thing. That's really what it means. And behavior-based safety could be an extremely powerful component, because what better way to diagnose where the system's broke than where people are unable to do it the right way? That's where the pain is. That's where we could put the medicine. And yet that's the place where behavior-based safety never achieved its full potential, because by the time you got, and you know this, Larry, as well as I do, by the time you got enough of the organization out there doing observations and you had reduced the resistance to that, you were tired. The organization was wore out. And so the second half was easy to just sort of let that slide. And the other thing is, a lot of managers at that time did not understand this really was about improving the whole system, not just fixing those behaviors out there that I keep seeing on accident reports. So behavior-based safety fell victim to fix the employee, not the system, a little bit.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. I also wonder whether it fell victim a bit to the pundits and the competitors. In other words, you've got to, whether it's a big opening and whether it's legit or not, if you're a competitor, you push it, right? And so, I think that there was a fair bit of the slack, like, you're blaming the employee. I mean, I know, I don't know. I think I've told you this story before, but I was, it was a big conference in Anaheim. I'm not sure, NSC, ASSP, whatever, but there's lots of hotels and conferences in Anaheim because of Disneyland, and there was 2 shuttle stops. And I didn't know which one it was, so I got about 20 feet away from the one. There was a guy about 20 feet away from me, and I said, "Is this the shuttle stop for the safety conference?" And he said, "Yes, it is, Larry." And I said, "You know who I am?" And he said, oh, I know who all you guys are. You and Krause and Spigener and Geller. I know you all. And I'm like, really? He said, yeah, all you behavior-based guys. And I said, well, who are you? And he introduced himself. I recognized the union he represented as being one that was none too thrilled with this stuff. And all I said to him is, I said, do you have kids? And he said, yeah. I said, do they know what the word be careful means? He said, of course. I said, how'd they learn that? And he just looked at me and he said, oh. I said, so behavior is important, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's interesting, Larry, that's absolutely true, what you say, but it's interesting how that came about. And let me tell you how that came about. Is there were a significant number of people, and there always will be these people who are looking for a quick fix. And so they looked at behavior-based safety as a way not to have to improve the system, to work the employee only, which the employees figure that out real quick. The second thing that happened was, and you said this at the front, this was a tidal wave between 90 and 2000. It really was. I mean, the popularity of this grew exponentially, and a lot of practitioners got in there who probably, I know this is going to sound self-serving. I don't mean it to be. It's just a fact, who had no business in there.
Well, exactly. And I remember. Yes, exactly.
So what happened was, with all these people out there extolling behavior-based safety, it became a fad. And there were companies who would call you up and say, my corporate guy told me I have to do this. Think about that for a minute. My corporate guy told me I have to do this. And so,
we get that all the time, Jim, all the time. Yeah.
So think about what that means. What that means is I want to do the cheapest, easiest, quickest, less complicated thing I can do. I'm not really interested in understanding how the technology could produce sustainable, long-term reliability. What I'm interested in is getting a process implemented. I don't care about the benefits of it or any of that. My mission is get it implemented. And that's where a lot of competitors, and I shouldn't say competitors, practitioners, that's where those guys, they were starving to death. They found a place where, man, there was a trough full of food here, and they just jumped right on it and did whatever those people wanted. And the union, rightfully so, recognized that and said, you know what? There's too much variation, too much ambiguity, and too much witchcraft in this. We are not going to support it. But what we found is
too much hocus pocus.
Too much blaming the employee. And they were right about that, because the mistake we made was not focusing harder and driving harder on the second half of behavior-based safety, which was using the data that was derived from observation to really diagnose where are those traps that an employee could fall into. Because in reality, you don't care about your employees if you leave traps for them to fall into, not just because they might get hurt, but because the temptation to get their job done and look good in their supervisor's eyes would cause them to take a shortcut that if they were caught doing it, they would also be punished. And so we realize now, and one of the things we're working on really hard, and we can talk about this as part of the evolution, is we're working on the reliability side of things now. So we believe behavior still plays a huge role, right? But what are we doing to make it more likely that the right behavior can be done? How are we setting it up so our employees truly believe that we're trying to make them successful? So that's
I used to tell people that you're looking at this behavior-based safety like it's some sort of bulletproof methodology. Observation and feedback is the basis of any athletic coaching scenario. Now, have you had a good coach that helped you and got better? Most of us were fortunate enough to. Have you had a coach that almost made you quit the sport because the coach was so bad? Or quit the musical instrument because the teacher was so, whatever it was, and everybody goes, well, yeah. And I said, so you've got to understand that whenever you go at behavior and people, it's a double-edged sword. If you don't do it well, it will make things worse. And the flood of companies wanting to get into behavior-based safety also was part of that draw for all of the the practitioners who really were, like you said, Jim, I mean, you can do compliance training on fork truck safety or rigging for whatever a day, and you can do behavior-based safety training for twice as much if you can get people to think you know what you're doing. And anybody can copy a checklist, but that doesn't mean that anybody can actually get the people to do this and do it well. And I used to tell folks all the time, I said, like, if you want to say you're doing it, that's easy. If you want to actually do it well and get the improvement, it's a lot of work, but it also goes back to the very foundational thing that you said on the expert panel, which is it's got to be real.
Yeah. So
if they think this is not real, this whole thing's dead in the water.
So let's go back to here's something I've learned. It's taken me a long time to learn. It took me a long time to learn this. But the classic mistake that was made, the fatal flaw, was that companies did not sit down and take out a clean sheet of paper and say, okay, let's first understand what this technology really is, this methodology. And then let's sit down and carefully craft what objectives that we have as an organization could this support and help further. So do we want more engagement? Do we want better relationships between our hourly employees and the supervisors? Do we want to have coaches who are better able to coach? Do we want to have better data? Do we? What are those things that we believe if we did this and did it right, we could accomplish all of those? If they had done that from the start, their implementations would be totally different than they are today. And furthermore, I will say,
except for, I think that you get the very first one, we're going to get our injuries down 50%, and then that's good enough.
That's
and then
not the objective.
Go back to work, right?
That's an unsaid objective to anybody. Period. Yeah. Right. So we didn't need that, but being able to fall on that objective stopped the progression to these other objectives that we could have accomplished. So let me say this. The balance between resources and objectives was also another failure. So if you make up that list of these objectives that you want to accomplish and you are unwilling to resource it, now that doesn't necessarily mean I've got to double my budget. It means I may need to delay my timeline. I need to go slower in order to not stress my budget. But I'm not going to give up on making sure these objectives get satisfied. And let me say one more thing before I get off this horse. There's not a company out there, Larry, who has implemented behavior-based safety who could not benefit from sitting down and doing an objectives alignment and retooling their process to achieve those objectives better. Because I promise you, very few companies sat down, and I've worked with some of them who have, and I can tell you the quality of their implementations were totally different than the quality of one who just said, come in here and do me. And so there's not a company out there who would not benefit from having some help defining clearly the objectives that as an organization they are living by and the values they're living by. And how could we retool our behavior-based process to help further those, to get more of those? So how could we change our strategy so that we get better relationships between our supervisors and our workers? How could we teach the workforce reliability better? How could we turn our organization into a learning organization better? You could sit down, put those objectives on a piece of paper, and I promise you, with a little bit of help, you could figure out how to retool to further those objectives.
Yeah. But Jim, I mean, so very often the objective was the quick fix, like you said. We want to, and even worse in the cases where corporate told us we had to do this, so this is why we're doing it. So there was even, and the idea we're doing behavior-based safety, and this. The reason I keep coming back to the quality of the engagement, when you're the actual conversation, if you will, the value of everybody's time in that exercise is what it was about. And yet people actually believed enough in this the process, the data, the ability to analyze the data and come up with meaningful, preventative measures, that they were convinced as long as they got enough cards filled in that the injuries would disappear. And this then, and because I just want to get this out in front of everybody, this is this belief that there was this kind of picnic science behind everything in the data versus it all came from a meaningful engagement that was genuine in the first place, was what begot the pencil whipping observation cards, the meaningless data that everybody knew it was meaningless because they were the ones turning in the bogus cards, and then the safety people presenting the recommendations as if they were gold. And I love your line, to people who are looking at them like a goat through a fence. So, I think, do you think almost that it worked so well so fast was also part of the problem, Jim?
Well, the fact that it got short-term, pretty immediate, pretty visible results. So if you got 25 people in your plant out there all of a sudden having many safety meetings with people, whether they were good or bad, when you're watching somebody, they're on their best behavior. And so you're going to get a short term, but pretty quickly, if nothing comes of that, the employee goes, really? You just want me to continue to try to work around this issue or that issue? Or you're going to send this guy out there who's just going to spout stuff at me, and he's going to spout the same thing at me every time? And so what happened was, and this is really damaging to the culture, is in places where that kind of stuff occurred, not only did people start pencil whipping, what you do is you create a culture of unethical behavior, because when I'm pencil whipping it, I'm lying.
Yeah,
and you make that.
I know. It's
leaders never thought about it like that. So let me just take a second and go back and pick up one other thing. This was a process. I was in a union organization where we were at war with each other. And I happened to be the chief steward in the union before I moved over to management. So I was on both sides of it. And I will tell you that done well, behavior-based safety is the very best cooperation developer between the union and the organization that there ever was, if it was done right. So
yeah, I same thing, and it's granted, as I said in one of the marketing descriptions, Jim, I didn't create the wave. I got to ride the wave in Canada, thanks to you, and I learned a lot in terms of what to do to launch SafeStart. The thing, everybody, I said, we'd been at this now for well over 10, 15 years. We were at the it's just outside of the Gaylord, the Grand Ole Opry, the Gaylord. This is 5 huge hotels complex. It's really quite amazing with all these atriums and stuff inside. And there's big conference there. And Jim's coming in, going to speak. I'm just coming up the stairs, and I got a chance to sort of say, "Hey, Jim, what you doing these days?" And instead of same old, he said, moving a lot into leadership, Larry. We go implement the same process, but sometimes they get a 75% improvement. Sometimes it's only 25%. We're pretty much doing the same thing. So, and he asked me, and I said, well, we're moving more towards the employees, the kids, the schools, the athletes, the very end user. If we can. And so that was about it. So Jim, sort of from there, I know that you guys really did a lot in terms of working with leadership groups, probably to get them to see this back end. Just for about 5 minutes before we get to the Q&A, do you want to kind of talk a bit about?
Yeah, I do. I think that's a really important.
We'll have you back, Jim, so we can talk more about all the brain-centric stuff. I knew we weren't going to get to all of it this show, but for just a bit if you can, and then we got to take some questions.
So we at DEKRA have probably done 3,500, 4,000 iterations of BBS. And one of the things along the way, we were asked by a young fellow, can you prove that BBS actually made the improvement? And to be honest about it, I didn't have an answer to that question. I didn't have that proof. I had a lot of anecdotal evidence. I had companies with their
data.
I had data. I had charts with the injury rate going down, but they're not just doing this. They're doing a lot of stuff. And so we did a study where we looked at what is the variation. Why is it that, and you said you got it almost right, Larry. We had companies who got 25% worse in the first year, and we had companies that got 75% better. Now, no company can operate on that level of variation in their business.
Yeah.
So we set about trying to find out what are the variables that cause that, because like you said, we were using the technology pretty consistently. What we found was immediately, after doing some work, that it was the culture. Now, we didn't know anything about culture at the time, to be honest about it. I mean, we knew the word, we kind of had a definition of it, but we weren't focused on culture. We're BBS guys. And what we found was if you try to put this into a culture that's not ready for it, you're dead in the water. So we went and studied all the culture research, and we found 9 factors that cut across all of the research on performance and culture. If you have those aspects, you're gonna do better than the company that doesn't. And we thought we had found the Holy Grail. So we created a real nice culture instrument to determine that, so we could be, I guess, more prepared. The problem was we had no idea why one company developed that strong culture and the other one didn't. So we went back to the drawing board, and we found that it depended on leadership. The quality of leadership depended on the culture, and the culture was the best predictor of performance and the life of BBS. So we moved very quickly because we had all these clients out there doing BBS who some were failing and some were succeeding, and nobody had any real good idea why. We began to move into helping the leaders in those companies that were struggling begin to practice in a way the leadership characteristics that were necessary to drive the right culture. And the improvement went from an average of 25% first year to 66% first year.
Well, that's, Jim, I always wondered whether it be like the perception survey idea with Dan Peterson was actually gaining traction. It didn't tip.
Right.
I always thought that what happened was behavior. I mean, I'm not trying to say that,
right,
the safety world has the, squirrel kind of thing, new shiny object, but there is a bit of what's new, what's buzzy, like you said, buzzwords in our business is.
Yeah.
And Larry, I think BBS kind of took everybody's attention away from the value that the perception surveys could bring to their culture. And it's only like years later that the cultures that it came sort of back in, right?
Well, this was the first time. This was the first time that any research had been done. And we didn't do any research. We just researched the research. Yeah. But it was the first time that somebody could empirically say, if you have these 9 things and you're working on them, there's about a 0.35 to 0.50 correlation with performance. In other words, if you put these in place, it will explain more of the variation and remove more of the variation in your performance than any other leading indicator. So it gave us a place to be able to say to these companies, look, leaders, you need to work on these 3 things, and here are the behaviors that you're doing that are holding you back from gaining that. And we found that that was the horsepower that was necessary to begin to get some of these processes to really have sustainability and reliability. Now, that was back in the mid-2000s, early to mid-2000s. We now know even more. We understand this just culture, learning organization, human performance reliability stuff, and how to begin to tie that into it. But all of this is about human performance reliability. And when I say reliability, what I'm talking about is, do people do the right thing, and can they? Do they and can they do it at the right time? Do they and can they do it the right way? And do they and can they do it for the right reason? And if you as a leader can create that, then you are going to be successful. And so what we figured out was what are the components necessary for those four things to really be true in your organization? And those are really important things. And that's where we've been, we're doing a lot of work in that area, and we do less work in actually implementing BBS, not because BBS is less important. It's because it is matured as a technology. And I would say, Larry, that there are probably 3 times as many companies doing their own implementations than there are that hire you or me or Aubrey or
I think
anybody. And so that's a mature business. What's really important now is that we create an environment where that can be done well and thrive. And for example, a leadership behavior that's really important is this setting down and getting your objectives straight. Another behavior that's really important is getting the budget right for the objectives you want to accomplish. If you don't do that, you're going to sink.
Yeah, Jim, I think so much we also learned as well. And although it's very intuitive, people look back on it, that the likelihood that our organizations knew as much as we know now 30 years ago is impossible. So, I also think too that this is a quality activity if it's done well. I've seen incredible results. I've seen it also cause problems because it wasn't done well. And as a result, it's easy for people to slag it, right? And then, like from a business point of view, once everybody and their brother and their brother's uncle started doing behavior-based safety training, from a business point of view, it was getting difficult to control the quality from where we were. So, we're obviously looking at, bigger, better ways to help people. But yet I think in a lot of cases, so much of this comes back to what you said at the very beginning, that meaningful engagement, that it's genuine and being able to make that connection. Now, Mike, I don't know if hopefully you've got some of the questions and you can come on screen and maybe give Mike and I a couple here and there. Hi, everybody. Here's our producer, Mike Shaw.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. So what have you got, Mike?
Well, first of all, guys, this is a stimulating conversation. I think you guys could talk for 10 hours, not just 45 minutes. So I'm sorry to interject, but there are some really great questions that have come in from the audience, and thanks everyone for participating. So the first question comes in from Jim Heisman, and he sort of, because you mentioned engagement was the sort of secret sauce, if you will, for successful BBS. But amid the pandemic, Jim, you said this, it's taken a back seat. And he said, pandemic aside, are we losing some of that engagement today?
And I would say yes. And maybe necessarily so. I'm not saying that we should have not paid attention to the pandemic, but the pandemic is going away, and we need to recognize that we have lost some of that engagement. I don't think we'll ever go back to where we were. I don't think we have to get the engagement. So I think the engagement, as we go back, needs to be planned. How are we going to get more meaningful engagement given the new world that we live in, the new use of technology and some of those things? So technology is actually, if you do it right, an engagement enhancer. A lot of people think technology is going to take engagement away. I'm telling you, if you sit down and think about it, and I have, there are ways to make the technology actually improve the engagement. So that's I think you're right.
I believe so too, but I also, I joke with my kids saying, if you learn how to talk, the world of sales and marketing is yours, because none of your friends know how to talk. All they know how to do is text you guys. So if you can just learn how to talk, you'll be ahead of the crowd. But they engage with technology, as you said, Jim. So again, the leverage there, if you employ it correctly, is huge. What else you got, Mike? Thanks, by the way, for that question. Jim, that was a really good question. Appreciate it.
Well,
there's more, and these questions sort of build on each other, so I think it's really great engagement. But the next question came in from Sylvester Maya, and he said, what role do you see leadership playing in the second half of BBS? And that was sort of, Jim referred to it as using data derived from observations to remove the traps that the employees fall into. So what role do you see leadership playing in the second half for BBS?
So my take on that is, if we would have known what we know now, we would have divided a BBS implementation into 2 phases. We would have had phase 1, getting observation and feedback going and data gathering. And then we would have reformed another steering committee, and we would have had more leadership on that steering committee for how are we now going to take this data and utilize that data in removing those traps. So the role leadership plays is leadership controls the purse strings. So if something's going to get fixed in the organization, leadership needs to furnish the resources for that. They need to believe that it's the right thing to do, and they need to have participation from the workforce that that is the right way to do it, and not just have some engineer put in some fix. They need to get that input from the people. But I see that as it's an extension, but it is a separate process that ought to be done. And we ought to see those 2 things as being connected at the hip. But one is, do we get out and change people's behavior and gather data? And the second, where we need to and where it's the right thing to do. And then what do we take from what we saw out there to make it so we don't have to do as much observation if we didn't want to? In other words, we set it up so the right behavior can be done. And that's leadership's role. And look, if leadership doesn't understand this process, they will never understand that role. They will see it as the hourly guy's process. This is not the hourly guy's process. This is the organization's process. And if this fails, leadership ought to be totally accountable for it.
Well, I mean, but cut yourself, I think. I'm not trying to let you off the hook, Jim, in terms of what we should have known, but you've also got to acknowledge that 30 years ago, things were different too, right? In other words, there was more mistrust. So by enabling an employee-driven process where they looked after their own data and they kind of had a firewall between their behavior and getting fired from the managers so they could improve themselves without blame and discipline. That was kind of key. You know what I mean? Like,
but we built
leadership out then became a huge problem in terms of it being sustainable.
Yeah.
But you gotta, back then there was more mistrust. So, I don't know whether or not you could have got it jointly launched as easily back then. Now, there's no reason. Now there would be no reason to separate it out.
I would not have jointly launched it. It's what I'm saying. I would have launched the first part first. I would have used it to build trust. In other words, nobody got disciplined, nobody got whatever. And then management's role wouldn't be out watching the hourly employees. It would be helping them with the data they gathered to fix things. And to your point, Larry, we didn't know. That's what I meant by knowing what we know now. But let me give you one more example here. Had we sat down and done the objectives exercise, we would have figured this out a lot quicker.
I know. Me too. I realized. I heard you do that. It was just a talk you did. It was a 5-minute thing, and I went, God.
Well, we're running.
Really, just for the sake of 30 minutes with those guys, you could have paved the road instead of bumpy gravel. But anyhow, Mike, is there more questions? Because I know we only got about 7 minutes or 5 minutes or something.
Yeah, there are a few more streaming into the chat, so I'll try to just give a couple more because that's what we've got time for. And this one, they're kind of 2 that combine. So this one comes in from Debbie Abrigo, and she says, how do we make this a sustainable process once done properly? And on that same kind of linear thought, Scott Cherbock said, too many BBS programs die when a program believer leaves the organization. I think the challenge is sustainability. The process often is perceived by ops as too prescriptive and bureaucratic. Are those the elements that need to be addressed? Can that be bridged by integrating with performance operational metrics?
That's about 5 questions.
No,
right
that's
there.
actually,
Wow.
it's actually one question. And there's one answer to it. And that is that what we didn't do a good job of, we know how to do it now, but we did not do a good job of setting up governance. So that, and somebody was very perceptive. All these people who talked about this were very perceptive in that we made this dependent on a champion. And if that champion left or that great facilitator left, the process was a house of cards unless somebody else could step in with that same passion. And so what we've figured out now is if you set up the right governance process where you have a process for overseeing, managing, measuring this stuff, that is a structure, an actual structure, you sustain it. Now, you want to make sure
that took us a while too. Corporate governance committee. Oh yeah, exactly. Like,
well, it's important. The governance is truly important, Larry. I mean,
well, they know how to run a multinational company. You would have thought they would have been able to run this, but we didn't.
You got to remember, this was you guys go do it.
Yeah, I know, and we learn the same lessons is kind of, it's a bit.
Well, we know the beautiful part is we know them now.
Well, yeah, I know, but
maybe we can have another one of these just on part of that topic for people, because it really is important. It means whether your process. So I was at our last SIA and I was talking to guys who had been doing this for 24 years. 24 years. And when I
remember you saying they had hats that like 24, like, obviously some that didn't make it.
You know what? It's because they had a great governance process in place.
That part, can you just for a minute, Jim, I don't know, talk a bit about that? Because, I mean, this is what sorry, I don't know who it was that asked the question, but thank you very much. The champion leaving, and this could be BBS, it could be SafeStart, it could probably be HOP. You didn't realize how much left with that person. Now, they may have been somewhat territorial. In other words, this may have been their baby, and so other people didn't want to kind of get involved or elbow their way in. But what we found was that, no, you needed to make this like a formal succession process. Like, otherwise, you were hoping that it would get filled. And if it didn't, like, you knew it would die.
Yep.
So can you talk just a bit, Jim, about that? And how?
Yeah. So succession is a minor part. In reality, it is a component of a governance process, but it clearly isn't enough. So governance means that we take the components of BBS that we're depending on to reach our objectives, and we figure out what are the metrics we're going to use to assure that that's still going. And then we set up a formal process for that being embedded in performance metrics on people, performance metrics on the organization. It gets built in just like, if I'm running a unit, when I was in operations, I had a budget I had to report on. I had production numbers I had to report on. I had maintenance numbers, quality numbers. I had all those things that we had to measure to assure that this business unit keeps making a profit and running well. BBS has to be seen the same way. It's got to be part of that. Same exact process structure. So you've got a steering team. Who do they report to? What do they report? What's their job? How clear is that? So, and management, what are their responsibilities?
It's come a long way from the donut eaters we used to talk about, or you used to talk about. Hey, Jim,
Bingo.
Are you going to have donuts? Okay, I'll be on the committee. Yeah, right.
Yeah. So really setting down, once again, with a clean sheet of paper and figuring out how do we keep this thing rolling, alive, moving us toward our objectives. How do we create this level of if you don't plan for that, if you get it, it's only luck. Yeah. So I'm back to, there's a lot of people on the phone or on Zoom listening to us, Larry, who happen to be unlucky enough to be in an organization where they just did this and they didn't think about all this. It's time now to start thinking about it. It's time now to sit down and say, we've been doing BBS for 4 years or 8 years or 12 years. Is it really getting us where we want to go? And if the answer to that is, I don't know, let's figure that out, and let's figure out how to move it forward and then keep that forward momentum sustainable. You can do it. There's not a company out there that's not smart enough to plan for this and make it happen.
No, and it's interesting too in retrospect, because I feel kind of bad about it too, going like, if you had have just thrown it around to the people and said, okay, so what is the likelihood that this will survive for literally forever and ever, like your maintenance process here, without the same sort of management structure that you're maintaining the equipment with? Only, like there'll be regular maintenance required. There'll be regular, new parts, things wear out, new people. I remember you talking about, like, you can't ask people to be an observer forever and ever. It's like having to put up with a hangnail on your finger forever and ever. You need to give them, I think, an 18-month tour of duty and let them know that this is, it's not like this is all you're expected to do, but we want you to do it well for that period of time.
So to answer your first question, if you went back 31 years when I started, I know of one company that for sure that is still kicking the can as hard as they can. I know of several that are still kind of doing it, but if you went there, you might not really recognize it, and they clearly wouldn't recognize that it was BBS. So I think it's real wisdom to think about this the same way you think about how do you keep the plant running. You have to do regular maintenance. You have to do new engineering. You have to upgrade. You have to do all those things. Now, if you don't plan that deliberately and have a governance process to assure that that occurs, then you're dependent on the strongest person that you can get in there to try to keep this thing going. And that's not a good bet. That is not a good bet at all.
No. And it's also, as soon as that person leaves.
Yeah. Now,
quite often the hole's too big.
And back to the I make a guy an observer forever. The Cambridge research, which is solid as a rock, best research I've ever seen done on this kind of stuff, basically says that you get more impact by having observers on a temporary basis. That having an observer forever and not giving them a chance to, and it isn't because it's that hard of work, it's that they go back and they sort of see new stuff and they reorient themselves, and you bring them back around 18 months later, give them some refresher training, and just like anything else, they're fresher at it.
Fresh set of eyes again, yeah. Well, you've also got the whole reticular activation system thing, so we want to get you back, Jim, to talk about some of the brain-centric stuff, because I know everybody's kind of interested in that. Certainly it's helped me a lot in terms of it didn't change things, but it certainly helped everybody understand better why they needed to do some of the things that they sort of knew they needed to do all along. Never.
I think
I could talk with Jim for another hour. I mean, I'm sure it'd be worth it.
I've got a hard stop. I hate to say it.
Well,
before I know, let me thank you so much for hosting this.
Oh, thank you very much for being here.
I want to thank everybody who joined. I appreciate the fact that you're on here and you're trying to improve the lot of those around you. And I think that's a noble, really noble thing to do. I know I've drawn energy from it for 31 years. And so I'm looking forward to another one of these. Love to talk about the Cambridge research some. Love to talk about the brain-centric some. I think all of it will make you a stronger safety leader if you're listening to this. So stay tuned for a lot more information around all these things. Thanks, Larry. I got to go.
Oh, Jim, thank you. We'll have you back on in a couple months. All the best, everybody. And and do stay safe until you get that get the vaccine. And I'm not sure it's 100%, so stay safe anyhow. Thanks very much, everybody. All the best. Bye-bye.